I have the pleasure of chairing the panel that's going to discuss prospects and challenges on economy, trade, and opportunities to invest. So we're not going to get into the political side of the house here, political insecurity. That was the last panel, which I thought was just excellent. We will examine current macroeconomic trends, particularly bilateral trade agreements and economic activity outside, including the garment manufacturing business. And when I look at the scope of Bangladesh's economy, I think most of you are probably familiar. It's grown almost 6% per year since 1996, but it's contracted some, and I think Piash will probably cover some of this. Almost 50% of Bangladeshis are employed in the agricultural sector. Rice is the single most important product. Garment export growth and overseas remittances have totaled 13% of the GDP in 2013. Just to quote a statistic, in June 2012, Bangladeshis working abroad, mostly in the Middle East, sent back 13 billion, or nearly 14% of the income. So, and no doubt, the Bangladesh economy has tremendous challenges in the future. There is widespread poverty and corruption, and I think we'll probably talk a little bit about that, but there are certainly opportunities there that we can capitalize on. We got two very distinguished panelists here, and Piash spoke at the previous one, so I won't go through his resume either. Of course, he's a professor of economics and social science at Brac University in Bangladesh, so he's very conversant on what's going on there. And we've got another great panelist, and that's Dante, Disparte, an old friend of mine. He is the U.S. Managing Director for Clements Worldwide, which is a leading risk management firm and insurance brokerage serving customers in more than 180 countries. Dante is a specialist in risk reduction. He's studied risk, strategy, and business. He's a graduate of the Harvard Business School, and I know also Goucher and Stern, and speaks 6 languages, but I only understand 1, so we'll do English here today. I do some Spanish, but we're not going to talk that today. With that, let me turn it over to Piash and let you go ahead and have the floor for 10 to 15 minutes here, and then we'll turn it over to Dante, and then we'll hopefully have a spirited question and answer period.
Sure. I mean, let me begin with a confession. I'm not an economist. Remember that commercial? Well, many of you are too young to remember the commercial. I'm not a doctor, I play one on TV. So I'm not an economist, I play one on TV. I'm a political sociologist by training. Winston Churchill once said, war is too important to leave it to generals. My apology to General Cheney and General Manrizama. I think economics is too important to leave it to economists. So those of us who are social scientists from other persuasions can actually talk about economics once in a while. Jokes aside, on a more serious note, what I try to do in my work is I try to look at some of the political, sociological, historical dimensions of economic development. And one of the things that I really focus on is the conditions to which a development alliance can develop in a country like Bangladesh. And I talk about multiple levels of equilibrium among different actors. For example, I talk about an equilibrium between the state and market forces. I mean, those days are gone when we could talk about a purely state-centric approach. I mean, there was never a purely state-centric approach, not even in the Soviet authoritarian model. But on the level of development, you recognize that state cannot be the sole actor who can initiate or promote economic development. At the same time, unless you are a very conservative neoclassical economist, you will not argue that market can be the sole determining force either. I mean, there has to be some kind of a dynamic interplay between the state and the market forces. And that is an important precondition for development in Bangladesh. There will also have to be an equilibrium between the local capital and international capital. I mean, how do you negotiate international capital? What kind of conditions do you have for inviting international capital for investment, for trade, and other things is important. And it is also important to have some kind of a balance, some kind of equilibrium between capital and labor. Because labor is an important component of economic strategy. And labor issue is an issue that we face in Bangladesh almost on a daily basis, especially the garments industry, which is a major player in economic growth in Bangladesh right now. and an unhappy, unsatisfied labor force cannot be a very productive labor force. We want an educated, disciplined labor which is globally competitive, but that labor has to be rewarded. And how do you reward labor is an interesting question, and the other panelists will be able to address that. But some kind of balance between capital and labor needs to happen. In many ways, the East Asian countries have achieved that. The tripartite alliance between the state, international capital, and local capital informed the development strategy in Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, to some extent in Malaysia, and the labor capital dynamic. Not adequately, not completely, but is addressed in various East Asian development settings. China in its own way, again, not completely, not adequately, but China in its own way is also trying to address the labor capital issue. So that's my first sociological take on the issue of economic development in Bangladesh, and these are the issues that need to be addressed. Secondly, I also feel that whenever we talk about economy, we cannot only talk about economic growth. But even if we talk about economic growth, we have to talk about from a more comprehensive development framework, something that Amartya Sen talks about. Amartya Sen talks about the fact that economic development does not only mean growth. I mean, of course, we have an impressive growth rate since 1996, but we also need some kind of a redistributive measure. We also need some kind of a sense of empowerment from citizens, consumers, workers. We also need a sense of security in a physical sense, in economic sense, in other senses. Gender is definitely a very important factor in economic development. We need to bring gender into the equation, making women workers more productive, making women consumers more empowered, making women citizens more meaningful participants in the development process. I mean, these are all important dimensions. And that redistributive welfare role of the development state is important for economic, and which is very important. The technical subject on investment, and we can talk about technology transfer and so on and so forth. But as a sociologist, I would like to use the phrase that Shafqat Munir actually mentioned in the previous session, democracy deficit. Democracy deficit is a major problem in Bangladesh, and the argument that I make over and over, the present apparent economic stability is not sustainable without some kind of a democratic framework. For a number of reasons, the East Asian authoritarian model is not applicable to Bangladesh. For a number of historical reasons in Taiwan, South Korea, Singapore, the state evolved as an institution that could impose its will on the rest of the society. There's no effective social force in post-Cold War II South Korea, or Taiwan, or Singapore that could actually resist the authority of the state. South Asia is a different ballgame. South Asia has a different set of dynamics. And Bangladesh, as a part of South Asia, is resistant to that kind of authoritarian regimes. So my argument is, and I'll be more than willing to get into that in more details during the Q&A session, that without some kind of an effective democratic framework, development is not sustainable. And of course, we can talk about inefficiency and misuse and corruption, which is a major problem. And we can also talk about infrastructural issues. For example, if you look at direct foreign investment, a major roadblock in the way of effective direct foreign investment in Bangladesh is corruption. It's bureaucratic inefficiency in mismanagement. It's also lack of infrastructure, lack of road facilities, lack of electricity, gas, and so on and so forth. The point I'm trying to make is that in order to develop an effective development strategy, we need to develop a development state that is based on multiple levels of equilibrium among different actors who participate in the development process. We also have to recognize that the development state is not only interested in economic growth in a narrow sense. The development state is, or has to be focused on redistributive measures, which has important economic, political, and humanitarian dimensions. And we have to look at a number of concrete issues, the most important of which at this point is the democracy deficit. Or as Shafqat mentioned, the triple deficit of democracy, development, governance and development. And I think that's a fantastic phrase. And of course, bureaucratic corruption and lack of infrastructure. So that is the extent of my discussion right now, and I'll be more than willing to talk more during the question and answer session. Thank you.
Yes, I'll have some questions about what you said here in a minute. Let me turn it over to Dante for a second, let you speak, and then we'll banter.
Okay.
Great. Well, thank you first of all, General Cheney, for having me back, and good to see so many friendly faces in the audience, and pleasure to be here with you as well. The vantage point I wanted to take in delivering some opening remarks on Bangladesh was that of a U.S. investor or an international investor, and what types of frameworks would they look at in evaluating opportunities in Bangladesh. I think what's interesting, and I believe your remarks on equilibrium are a powerful statement. I think Bangladesh's future is bright for the simple fact that, one, you have a big demographic advantage, and I think a lot of the big investment houses, the way a lot of investors are looking at emerging markets and frontier markets, is informed by this notion that there's a fortune at the base of the pyramid. And with 160 million people, notwithstanding the turbulent present and the turbulent past, there's only one way for the country to go, which is up. And I think that is supported also in the structure of the economy, and it's supported also in a lot of the metrics that international investors would look at. In the late 80s, 85% of Bangladesh's economy was propped up by official development assistance. Today that number is a mere 2%. It may not say a lot about how that is being redistributed within the population of Bangladesh, but it does say a lot about Bangladesh's position in the rest of the world. Clearly, a lot of this is then informed by specific extractive resources and the garment industry, and again, the recent sort of event at Rana Plaza with the building collapse does say a lot about improving worker rights and sort of human rights in the country, but it doesn't necessarily remove Bangladesh from being investment grade. On the contrary, Goldman Sachs and the economist Jim O'Neill have characterized Bangladesh as an N11 country. So after the BRICS, Brazil, Russia, India, China, there's this next 11 that the global investment banks are looking at, and Bangladesh is comfortably in the top of that list. And so oftentimes capital, like so many other things to do with economics, it follows a herd mentality. So, I think that there will be a very, very interesting series of developments, a very interesting series of investments. And for Bangladesh's development to become broad-based, and one in which, so many of the public and the people of Bangladesh move to the consumer side of the equation, of course, depends on policies at the national level, not how Bangladesh interplays with the rest of the world as a trade partner and an investment destination. Additionally, some of the opportunities where I think there'll be very clear investments outside of the traditional industries of agriculture and the garment industry, you have this massive geographic advantage, which is also a risk. Of course, the Bay of Bengal and Bangladesh is in the process of developing this largest deep water port in the region. That has a lot of implications for shipbuilding, manufacturing, trade, and really becoming a regional trade hub, which has been a key driver for development for so many other nations around the world, is to figure out how to become that meeting point for the rest of the world's commerce. And as we know, of course, the region itself, like the country, only has one way to go from an economic vantage point, which is up. In addition to this, I think, Bangladesh has great opportunities with technologies. Just yesterday, Bill Gates was remarking that, like so many countries, think of Kenya, for example, which has leapfrogged over fixed line telephony, leapfrogged over brick and mortar banking. I think the same opportunities hold true in Bangladesh, that a lot of the things we may take for granted in terms of how things are done and what types of hurdles you have to overcome as an investor, the opportunity in Bangladesh is much more radical. It is a matter of how do you leapfrog the traditional mechanisms that folks have become used to. And so in Gates's remarks, he's highlighting that mobile banking, he's just put a large investment in a mobile banking startup and initiative in Bangladesh. And so I think a lot of these types of new models really do have an opportunity to take off. After all, Bangladesh, with Nobel laureate Mohammed Yunus's Grameen Bank, is really in the forefront of how to reach this base of the pyramid and bring these folks into the consumer economy and middle class. So I think there's a whole range of sectors that become very, very compelling investment opportunities. And what we do in my company is help them figure out how to address the types of risks that they would face in making a cross-border investment. So what are those types of risks that you would see, in my view, in the Bangladeshi context? One of them is that anything that you would put on your on the asset side of your balance sheet as a nation is also your liability. So it's a very populous country, the 8th or 9th largest in the world, depending on who you ask. That's both an asset and a liability. It's a densely populated country as well, with not a ton of livable land given the confluence of the two giant rivers that are emptying out into the Bay of Bengal. So this is both an asset and a liability. You could imagine that overcoming some of the energy challenges that would block investors from the energy supply side can be addressed with this asset as well. So with hydro energy investments and different types of investments to break, again, the models that the West and other countries have used for their development, there will have to be a uniquely Bangladeshi sort of solution and a unique series of solutions that are instituted nationally given the context, because it is fairly special. So what types of risks would you face as an investor? I think one, just the complexity of setting up a business is a challenge, I think, and so the types of firms that you would attract to opportunities in Bangladesh would tend to be the larger ones, with clear extractive interest in mind, you know, and ultimately shifting to getting demand investment into the market, and the type of investment that stays, that isn't simply about what we can get out of Bangladesh, but what we can keep there and how we stay there, will really require opportunities around you know, consumer goods. Firms will have to learn how to miniaturize their products and you know, get things to scale so that more and more of the consumer base can you know, get access to these types of products. But yeah, so I think just, you know, I don't want to rattle off the long list of metrics. I think it's too late in the afternoon, and I'm sure the audience is very knowledgeable about it, these types of, you know, issues that you would get from the World Bank and such. But happy to take any questions as well.
Dante, I love your last name because I see a disparity between what you said and what Piash said. You know, Piash, not to overly characterize what you said, but it's kind of pessimistic. I mean, democracy, deficit.
I think I was trying to be realistic.
Well, and I think what Dante says, when I listen, especially when you talk about rankings economically and the opportunities available, you're more on the optimistic side, you're more on the pessimistic side. So in order for business to succeed, I think what you're saying is this democracy deficit has to be fixed, and the corruption has to be fixed so that his guys can make an investment.
At rest. I mean, you know, you can probably eliminate corruption overnight in a country like Bangladesh, but we need to begin to address that issue.
So would you claim that that's the #1 obstacle to increase for?
It's one of the primary obstacles.
One of the primary obstacles.
I still see, you know, I don't think I'm a pessimistic person at all. Well, I live in that country, so I have to face the reality on a day-in-day-out basis. And with due respect to Dante, I mean, it's not easier to be optimistic when you don't have to live there.
Absolutely.
Right. No, I don't think I'm pessimistic at all. I mean, I'm willing to give credit to where credit is due. And if the government is doing good things, I think they deserve our praise. But there are a number of things that we have to understand when you look at these figures. First of all, none of these achievements are results of the policy of a singular government. They are the results of a continual process of works of successive governments. Number two, private capital plays a very important role there. According to some economists living in the country, that if there is no government in Bangladesh right now, there will probably be still a 4 to 5% growth rate. But that will not ensure economic development because the sense of security will not be there and redistributive measures will not take place. Non-governmental organizations are extremely important, whether you talk about Grameen Bank, you mentioned Grameen Bank, and probably some of you know that the founder of Grameen Bank, who was basically the founder of the rural credit policy, a revolutionary policy, was insulted, humiliated by the present regime in every possible way. And his only fault was that he got a Nobel Prize for Peace. And our Prime Minister, you know, I think that could be one of the 10, 11 commandments. Thou shalt not covet somebody else's Nobel Prize. So, that's what our Prime Minister did. And of course, the role of the consumers and the workers. So no, I mean, I'm more than willing to positively appreciate the achievements of the government. And the government has done good things in terms, if you look at development in a narrow, confined sense. But I think economic development in Bangladesh is part of the larger context.
Right. Well, if I may adjure the question, it's not every day that you hear in a panel, I'm neither an optimist nor a pessimist, I'm a realist. So I would say that there is no disagreement between what you're describing and what I'm describing.
Yeah, I didn't see any disagreement at all. I was nodding approvingly throughout this discussion, didn't I?
And while I don't have to take a long flight back to Dhaka later on this evening, to me, it's just a simple strength in numbers model, that no matter what the government is doing, just like when policies fail to work for the private sector in the United States of America, the businesses that get on with it, notwithstanding the state, are the ones that make a difference. And I think the same holds true here. There's no distinction. My view of business and opportunities and where you invest and how you do it, be it local, regional, or international, it's informed by pragmatism. And I think the types of things that, again, that is informing Goldman Sachs' opinion of Bangladesh and how it's getting on these lists, it's just these fundamentals that they're all looking at. It is a bit cut and dry. It doesn't depend on whether democracy is present or not, because that's how you get risk-adjusted returns on investing in Nigeria or investing in Egypt or investing in Bangladesh. None of the things I'm describing require the preconditions of a fair, legitimate government, right? All of those things you do when you then have a national strategy and all the rest. But as far as an investor goes, they want to invest in emerging and developing markets, notwithstanding the political risks, because that's how they're getting their above-market returns. Right? So it's an agnostic view as to who's in office, whether they were elected, and what levels of corruption you're dealing with. It's just a view on, we want access to 160 million people, a large deep water port.
Right. I totally understand what you're saying, but at the end of the day, economy is political economy. Right. And I think it's in the best interest of the foreign investors to be able to invest in an economy where they don't have to face constant labor unrest, where they don't have to face corrupt officials every morning who will ask for bribes. They're not going to face law and order problems. So I think, and with due respect to the mainstream economists, I think one of the limitations, one of the shortcomings of mainstream economics is not to include those variables into the equation. It is not only investment opportunity, does not only include cheap labor or government's willingness to, it also means political security, it also means law and order, it also means social security.
No doubt. And I wouldn't sit here today and debate that for an instant.
Right.
The only point I would make, though, is that because there are international investors, the next time a building collapses in Bangladesh, there are consequences on a global scale. And so the fact that there are investors is a normalizing force on otherwise governments that have no interest in changing, policies that don't quite work, labor unrest, etc., demanding better rights. I mean, you think of the Rana Plaza collapse. I've spoken about this in other events. It had an immediate knock-on effect on the global supply chain of every garment firm on the planet. From Benetton, Zara, Gap, Banana Republic, and everybody in between suffered a vicarious liability because of that, even though many of them were not directly implicated as global brands. All it took was to find the Benetton logo or the Zara logo among the rubble with more than 1,100 casualties for those firms to suffer a knock-on effect to their supply chain. That is a corrective force. That's the reason the US government came in and said, hey, we'll take a look at this preferential trading relationship until such time as there's improvements in the conditions under which people are working. And so a cold economic choice, which was to invest no matter what and to turn a blind eye to human justice and standards and corruption, now leads to sufficient pressure to actually institute change. Imagine what would happen if that same building collapsed and there were no giant Western garment manufacturers in the rubble with the victims. Nothing would have changed. So that's kind of what I'm advocating, is a realistic, pragmatic approach to how capital and firms in the West and the rest of the planet can get involved in frontier and emerging markets. The simple truth for those firms, this isn't altruism, this is realism, is that if you're not there, you're not relevant in 100 years. This is the emerging and frontier market century, it's not the West. And so I'm advocating for deep integration, deep economic integration, deep political and social integration, and with that will come a normalization, the types of standards, of the equilibrium we're all talking about. I think those two things will work in lockstep.
No, I totally agree with you. My only addition to the argument is, and probably it's not even an addition, probably it's already implied in your argument, that human rights or labor rights are not extra economic factors which incidentally affect economics.
Right.
They are economic factors.
Absolutely.
They're part of the economic equation in today's world, and that's my argument.
Now, this is a great conversation, but I want to get others involved, and I know we have some questions. We have a roving microphone, if you could, and it's coming. I'm going to right up here in front first. Please identify yourself and have a good question.
Thank you, General. Shafkat Munir from BIBS. I have a question for both panelists. I would like to hear your take on the potentials of the emerging deep sea port at Shonadia. We know a lot about its geostrategic ramifications, but I would like to hear from both Dr. Karim and Mr. Disparte about how you see the economic potentials of the deep sea port. And one specific question for Dr. Karim, if I may. How do you see the potential of the energy sector in Bangladesh in terms of the future of US investment going into Bangladesh, in the energy sector in particular?
I think, should I go?
Yes, please.
I think both instances, great is the answer. I mean, I think the open port is a great economic resource if we can play our card well. As far as energy is concerned, I mean, there are too many political pressures. I mean, you know, about coal, about gas, and so on and so forth. And it is important to have oppositional sentiments about the appropriate use of energy sources or the ownership of energy sources by multinational corporations. But I think pragmatism is actually what we should look for. I mean, and how adequately, how appropriately we can use our energy sources, how we can explore new energy sources are important factors. And I think Bangladesh does have that great potential for energy on various levels. And if we can go beyond our narrow political interests, and some of the people who are actually raising issues about coal and other issues are very well-meaning people. I know many of them personally, but I think there is a pragmatism deficit there. I think if we can address that issue in a pragmatic fashion, I think we have great potential.
Well, I mean, the energy question wasn't addressed to me, but the pragmatism comment resonates in my mind. Someone who's telling you how to power yourself and with what options are best and the greenest isn't living in darkness. So I think the pragmatic approach would be, how do we, clearly, to the extent you could make the choice, you go for the one that's the most economical over the long run, but ultimately lifting 160 million people into the light, literally, isn't a task that's taken very simply, nor can it be done, I think, without environmental consequences on the other side, the trade-offs. As far as the port is concerned, again, it's an example of an opportunity to become the regional sort of deep water port, regional trading hub, the implications of Myanmar opening up as a nation that's sort of now being coaxed into the West, and the United States recognizing it officially as well. I think there's a lot of trading opportunities there. If I'm not mistaken, the port is being constructed by the Chinese.
Not decided yet.
Not decided yet, so it is still fresh news, so my information is fair. But yeah, to be determined, and I think, again, pragmatism, who builds it, whether there are political implications or not, doesn't change the fact that it gets done. And I think the model for lifting Bangladesh and creating investment-grade opportunities is really driven by who can get the work done and some degree of pragmatism. I'm not saying you throw all rules and morals to the wind, but at some stage it's about choices.
Right. And if I can just add one thing, I mean, the environmental issues are definitely important, and the trade-off may be painful. I mean,
yeah,
the trade-off may be very painful, but that's a pragmatic decision that we have to make at some point. But it is true, I mean, when it comes to the ownership of multinational corporations in the energy sector and such others, I mean, there are many cases in global economic history in recent time where economic resources were taken out of the country. It happened in Latin America. On the other hand, East Asian countries are relatively successful examples where the state and the local capital were able to negotiate with international capital in a more adequate way, where the economies actually benefited from international capital involvement in the economy. I think a great deal of it depends on the negotiating ability. And by negotiating ability, I'm not using the term narrowly, like sitting on both sides of the table and talking, but larger structural negotiation between multinational capital and the state and local capital. And that's where my equilibrium argument, I think, is very relevant.
Another question, I saw somebody over here on the left side. Yes, sir.
Thank you. I want to know from the panel, when due to democratic deficit, you find political institutions become extractive. It reflects on the economic institutions as well, as I said earlier on as well. And therefore, how do you see the economic prospect that you all have been talking about? You have extractive political institutions reflecting on the economic institutions turning into extractiveness as well. How this is going to reflect on the economy? Because, give me an example. We had Padma Bridge contract, international tender and all that. And there was a huge corruption. And it was cancelled by the World Bank, who were funding that. Due to the institutional problem in Bangladesh, Anti-Corruption Bureau, which was supposed to look into the matter and give a solution and sort it out, had become partisan because there was political interest in it. So likewise, many institutions in Bangladesh is becoming more and more extractive. You find the banks are being looted one after another with total impunity. And this is also reflecting on the economy. The stock market is being looted with the political patronization. This is also reflecting on the economy. So all the prospect that we have been talking about, economic prospect, my question to the panel, how this is going to reflect on the prospect of Bangladesh economy in the future?
Thank you. Yes.
Yeah.
You live there.
At the risk of a bit of oversimplification, I can see two major consequences of the extractive political practices. Number one, the best way to make money, and I'm using the term best in a value neutral way, by the way, the best way to make money in Bangladesh right now is to be a politician. I mean, in 3-4 years, you can literally make millions of dollars. So I think that discourages, legitimate investments. I mean, why should I go through the whole process of accumulating capital and investing it and going through all the risks if all I have to do is to become a politician and literally plunder money? I mean, I'm not overstating the case. I mean, that's a major thing. Secondly, not only money is being plundered, millions of dollars are being taken out of the country. Capital flight, illegal capital flight, which is a major problem for capital investment in the country. So I think that kind of politically motivated, politically inspired, politically aided extraction has a very harmful effect on the economy.
Depressing. Munir,
Do you agree?
Completely.
Okay.
Completely.
My question to both panelists. We are now seeing the potential for the so-called blue economy for Bangladesh. Now that we have got the maritime boundary limitations sorted out with both Myanmar and India. And Bangladesh is also being considered as a country that can be a net security provider to the Bay of Bengal region. So given these two potentials, how do you see this economy being positively impacted by the potential of the Bay of Bengal location that we are in?
I don't want to monopolize the conversations.
Well, I mean, again, you live there, though, so I think your monopoly is a good one. I mean, so a lot of what I do in my business is dealing with maritime security firms and piracy and the consequences to shipborne trade around the world, the Horn of Africa, the Strait of the Malacca Strait in East Asia. So there are going to be, I think, numerous opportunities for Bangladesh to create work, for Bangladesh to attract investments of the more permanent variety, because of its, again, that's what I was saying earlier, the things in your nation that you can keep on the asset side of your balance sheet are also your liabilities. So having this great deep water port, being in the location that you are at the crossroads of all of this potential regional trade, in conjunction with, I think, the development of many of the nations surrounding Bangladesh, or landlocked nations looking for outlets, I think this is just all potential, it all paints a potential upside for the country. And then, the risks that come with that and how to address some of those risks, I think there's some pretty compelling models and some pretty compelling business opportunities as well that can be had.
I agree. I mean, I think blue economy is the way for the future, especially because Bangladesh is a country where land is a very scarce commodity. You're talking about 160 million almost in this country, which is about the size of the state of Wisconsin. So the human land ratio is not very favorable on multiple levels. It can be an asset too, but it is a huge liability at least also. So opening up to sea as a resource, as an expanded territory, has enormous potential for the country, and in terms of fishery, in terms of mineral resources, and of course in terms of security. I mean, Bay of Bengal can be, a major security terrain for that region. This connection with the Indian Ocean. I mean, there are already talks about a shift from Pacific to the Indian Ocean, or Atlantic to Pacific to Indian Ocean, for a new security apparatus globally. Right? I mean, am I right? Okay. I'm going out of my territory a little bit. I mean, security is not exactly my area, but I think Bay of Bengal has very important security implications.
Good question. Yes, ma'am, right over here.
Hi, Shamrukh Mohiuddin with US Bangladesh Advisory Council and Lift Up Asia. With regard to skill development, that's another key component of attracting investments. First of all, Dr. Karim, do you feel that universities there, since you're also from academia, are doing a lot to attract companies by improving skills in the country? And if Dante, you could talk about companies looking at Bangladesh as also R&D destinations, not just for low value-added production, but for new R&D facilities or anything like that. With regard to the corruption issues, is there any move to look at separating business interests from political interests? I'm sure this is not a great time for that in Bangladesh, but I think a lot of us in the room know that a lot of business people are also playing roles as members of parliament or as ministers, and that's been throughout history, depending on whichever government's been in power, that's kind of been the status quo. But is this something that deserves to be looked at to kind of create a push for more transparency, and is it something that the universities can play a role in as well? Thank you.
Well, the human capital is extremely important, and human capital is important on a number of levels. I mean, when you look at, for example, manual workers, I mean, blue-collar workers, you don't only need cheap labor, you also need skilled labor. So the school system in general can play a very important role there. As far as university as a site for higher education and research, as an academic from Bangladesh, I think we are not doing what we're supposed to do. Dhaka University, which rather euphemistically is called the Oxford of the East, is not even among the top 1,000 universities in the country. Again, I'm not being pessimistic in the world. I mean, not 1,000 universities in the world. I'm not being pessimistic. I don't think our universities are doing a very good job in terms of promoting research, in terms of providing quality education. Unfortunately, I'm a university professor, so you're listening it from the mouth of the horse. We are, tragically politicized, our teachers' bodies, our student bodies. So there are problems, for sure. As far as separating business interests from political interests, I don't think we can identify a single market economy in the whole world where business interests are separated from political interests, including the United States. The question is how do you make it more tolerable? How do you make that business politics nexus work for a successful, meaningful economic growth or development? But I don't think they can be totally separated.
So I think the statement I had made earlier about Bill Gates' remarks hint at where some of the opportunities will lie. A lot of these organizations, the issue I think that when Bangladesh and any nation that is solely the destination of the development folks, I think that nation will have problems for a long term. And development of the kind that we're talking about on this panel is not a quick quick job. This is a nation that was basically come out of a very, very turbulent situation in its founding, you know, in the 70s, has gone through a number of setbacks politically and otherwise, a number of assassinations. I mean, so net, I think Bangladesh is doing very well from that historical lens, as briefly as it has been around as an independent nation. And the arc of its development is exciting, which is why, you know, folks looking at it from the outside, from Goldman Sachs and many other institutions, are saying, look, this is investment grade or nearly investment grade. But education is exactly one of the areas in which I think you can make a big difference. Literacy rates are not great, 61% for male, 52% for women in the country. And I would also look, you know, put a bit of pressure on the Bangladeshi diaspora. In fact, Sal Khan, who developed
the Khan Foundation.
Yeah, the Khan Academy has done great work in sort of tearing down brick and mortar education. He has had better educational outcomes for the people following his model here in the United States. And it's something that leverages technology to deliver this educational content. I would encourage Sal Khan, who is of course a part of the Bangladeshi diaspora, to, you know, make this work in Bangladesh as well, if he isn't already. But you know, so for me, education would be absolutely one of the areas where as either domestic solutions, regional or international solutions can step in as an opportunity, and not necessarily something that is going to be a hindrance to the country. Because again, there's only one way to go. And my point simply is that whether the government is doing it, the politicians are doing it, the people eventually have to, and the businesses eventually have to. And net, that shift from 85% of the economy being propped up by development aid to 2% today is a sign that you're generally moving in the right direction.
Great answer. One more question, all the way in the back on the right.
Hi, AJ Sugarman, Carnegie Endowment for International Peace. Hopefully the question is good on your second edition. So I take the point that the agnosticism and pragmatism of international investors leads them to focus on the fundamentals, but at the same time, there is a political level that matters for this, or we wouldn't see Narendra Modi struggling to get US investment in India. So I was hoping maybe Mr. Disparte could speak to what are, from the risk analysis perspective, the political factors that an investor would look at and say, you know, are there red flags here? What is stopping us? And then maybe Dr. Kumar could speak to whether those obtained in Bangladesh or are likely to.
That's a great question. So first of all, I think that as a prospective investor looking at an emerging market, and this is a generalization, not distinct to Bangladesh, but a prospective investor looking at emerging, developing, or frontier sort of market investment, politics will play front and center into their calculus, right? And so with that comes, you know, am I going to import something into the country or export something into the country or out of the country that will suddenly get hit with a capricious regulation and a crazy tax? Will I be able to repatriate the earnings and the income that I've developed in the country? Will the assets that I put in the country physically, human resources or otherwise, go on a one-way trip, or is there any opportunity getting them out? So I think that all of the frameworks that we've discussed today, you know, the rule of law, democracy, respective contracts, all of these types of things matter, and they matter a lot to international investors. What we do as a company is to help them put a fixed price on the types of things that that can make that investment, you know, completely fall apart, and therefore make a lot of these countries investment grade in the first place. So there's a lot of solutions available for political risk insurance. So the worst that a nation can do to an investor globally is to expropriate their assets, nationalize it, an act of terror, war, civil commotion, and the long laundry list of unfortunate events that can occur. That is an entirely insurable series of events, very, very easily, very fairly priced, and that type of price, that fixing that price, I think, helps investors and helps businesses, you know, build pricing models that are robust. And beyond that, then there's all of the rest of the inconveniences of operating in the rest of the world, and particularly in the emerging market context, that those too can be priced from a market vantage point. Because again, I don't see while there isn't a nation on the planet, to the good doctor's remarks, that has separated business and political interest, I think business's role is business. And when the road in front of your business doesn't work, it's in the business's incentive to help fix it. The tragedy of the commons is as alive and well in the United States as it is in Bangladesh. Difference is it's much more acute in Bangladesh. But the same narrative holds true wherever you look. So I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think that there is no magical checklist. Businesses cannot necessarily, looking in from the outside as investors, change the immediate course of a nation's political decisions. But I think over time, enough of them can. And you see that again with this factory collapse in Bangladesh. There's a lot of pressure for the nation to normalize things and improve worker rights.
And I don't think investors are going to read Aristotle and say, aha, democracy is the most ideal system. They're not going to do that, but they have a pragmatic interest in political stability. And my argument is that democracy is the only process, only system that can ensure that kind of political stability in a country like Bangladesh. See, democracy is not an abstract theoretical proposition here. It's a very concrete, pragmatic necessity. And if I can quote Winston Churchill twice in that session, who is not my favorite politician, by the way. I mean, he's a little too conservative for my taste. But Churchill once said that democracy is the worst system, except for everything else that we have tried.
Right.
And I think that's the need. There's a necessity of democracy. And without a successful democracy, a successful business climate is not going to happen in Bangladesh or South Asia in general.
You heard it here first. Democracy is the best of the worst options.
Right.
What a great.
How do you feel about that?
Yeah, I do. We're here. What a great way to close what's been a very stimulating afternoon. And I kind of wondered how this panel was going to work out, and I really think it worked out exceptionally well. Thanks to you, Piash and Dante. Business perspective and academic perspective is just amazing and fascinating. I have a number of people to thank, but let me start with the audience. You guys have hung in there. Really good questions. Oftentimes as a moderator, you get into these long-winded, and somebody's going to talk 10 minutes and then ask a stupid question, and none of them had here today. So I really appreciate your participation in coming to ASP. Please hit our website. We'll have all this stuff up tomorrow. We've been tweeting it, and then we'll record it. So please continue to come to our events. Munir and the Bangladesh Institute of Peace and Security, love working with you guys. I really appreciate you coming this year and what you've done for that and what you do for GMAC. It's great work, and I really appreciate it, and we're proud to be associated with you and host this event today. So lastly, let me thank both of our panelists. We give them a big hand. And my staff at ASP.